Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. Today we're going to talk about a future war. It's off the back of Dr. Jack Watling's speech on future land warfare. But today our guest is Major General Chris Smith, who's the Deputy Chief of Army. Sir, welcome.
Thanks, Todd. Good to be here.
You say good to be here, but you've contributed, I suppose, more than anyone else to the Cove Podcast specifically. But you're constantly trying to get back on and really trying to get some of the message down and talk about some real meaty stuff, which is awesome. Why do you find it so important to sort of do that, I suppose?
Well, one, I enjoy it, but two, I don't need to tell anybody that we're at a particularly important point. Things are changing. You know, I'm a very close observer of war and warfare. I'm pretty eager to make sure that we're discussing it, and I like discussions and so on, and I'm probably eager to make sure that we've got an army that's discussing and debating and challenging ideas, and I'm eager to be part of the discussion.
I think that's common across the board with many of the guests we've got. They genuinely reach out to try and get on the platform to do exactly that, to prepare people and have those honest conversations about, you know, where we're going in the future, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. I'll just highlight that your last episode was on the DSR and a bit of analysis there. It was awesome, particularly like the conversation around littoral versus amphibious, and you're talking about synonyms, like it's the same thing.
Exactly.
So we'll touch on that today. And your speech to RMC graduates as well, obviously that's on the Cove, so go and check that out if you haven't already watched it. But awesome talking about veiled speech, and that's probably my words, not yours, but talking about how we need to be more direct with our communications and talking about what's actually going to happen, I suppose.
I agree. And for what it's worth, I know it's maybe slightly off the topic, but the Chief and I just had lunch and we were talking about, and I had a conversation with somebody else earlier today about the difference between bureaucracies and professions. And if I'm not flagging what people don't already know, that we're about to have a very big focus in the Army on what it is to be a profession and look at what is the state of the profession in the Army. And I think we might be, or maybe not surprised, concerned, but they are very different things. And the way we speak, this passive voice, the lack of direct speech, not actually understanding the terms we're using, vague language, that sits in the world of bureaucracies. And us at the very senior end are the worst for it. But I think that's something that people will start to see a change.
I'll also just talk to my own personal experience, but the training officers at ADFA are also quite bad for it as well. I've just marked all their joint military education and training submissions, and some of the speech they use is very indirect, and the sentence construction is an interesting thing to go through, I suppose.
It's almost as if we take kids that learn how to write properly at school and then we make them worse. It's
to meet a word count. No, exactly right. So Dr. Jack Watling, DGFLW, spoke about a peak performance and how to maintain high performance throughout your career, which was absolutely awesome. But we're coming back, I suppose, to some more future war concepts and less so concepts, but more like what does it actually look like to bring it down, I suppose. But the question you ended the last episode in is, and Lieutenant Colonel Johnson asked you, will we be fighting in the next 5 years? You said, I don't know. And that obviously no one can tell. But what does it look like, I suppose, if we look out, and Jack does the same thing out from now until about the 10-year period. What does that look like? How do you think?
If we did fight, Look, and I've got to be careful because I can't remember what I said last time, but I don't want to discuss it.
There wasn't much in terms of, I suppose, episodes can only go so long. So, there wasn't much, I suppose. This is
what does, and maybe this is a bit of reflection on the broader one, but what does the warfare look like? And certainly I've been travelling the Army talking about this a lot. And Jack and I spoke in Melbourne, to sort of level ideas. My big idea is that the defence is always a stronger form of warfare. Defence now is particularly strong. Jack's view is exactly the same. There's a recognition that the thing that makes it so strong is that everything on the battlefield can be seen. You can't concentrate force now without it being seen and then rapidly fired upon by something that's precise and possibly long range. So it gives enormous advantages to the defender. But if you're able to get a jump on your enemy, and I think the Ukraine is a classic case where if you possess another's territory, so you're on the offence strategically, but you're defending tactically, you have an enormous advantage in bargaining position if you ever need to go to the negotiating table. I think that that's a reflection of what war might look for us in this region. And I think to some extent the requirements in the DSR for the Army to have offensive capability to deploy from here and then go and attack is recognition of that, notwithstanding that to do so puts us as the attacker at an enormous tactical disadvantage. But that's what we need to do. When I spoke to the graduating class at Duntroon, it was on a reflection of that, that kind of fighting. All of those technologies, the consequence of them is fighting that looks a hell of a lot like Stalingrad or the Western Front in 1915, that we need to, that the fighting that might happen in the South Pacific will look much like, I think, what we saw ourselves doing in that period, 1942 to 1945. That for us, warfare will look like fighting through prepared bunkers, little scope for manoeuvre, cooperation between infantry, armour and engineers in intimate support, and then supported by weights of suppressive, either direct or indirect fire. And then I think that's that expression. And I think, of course, if we're the lucky ones and we can sort of sit there and protect our own sites, that long-range strike from anti-ship missiles becomes an important thing. Forgive me, that's a little bit long-winded, but that's it's important we have that context, because I want to make it clear when we start to talk a little bit later about decision-making and so on, that I think a lot of the evolution of decision-making, and even including computing in decision-making, has been influenced by a targeting focus, which is a fires focus, and it conflates a few things, and it leads to a very sort of industrial and data-driven way of making decisions, and we think we can hand it off to computers. I want to make sure we understand that what the battlefield looks like is probably more like Ukraine or Buna 1942, 43, or Borneo or something like this, so that we understand the frame that I'm talking about.
So less so, I suppose, to use that fires analogy, like less so on a sensor picks up something, goes through an effects matrix, and then a predetermined decision is made by a commander at an incredibly high level, or delegated down, I suppose. You're saying that that's a fallacy to sort of impose that onto assaulting force or reconnaissance forces that are out?
No, I think that's right. But I think we need to keep in mind, it's not a new thing. It's been the case with how you use fires from the very beginning, that your fire control and coordination sort of mechanism might be driven by a targeting process, might be heavily centralised in certain circumstances. It might be very procedural. It's governed by priorities, and there might not be a great deal of room for creativity, and that's probably right. And particularly around cooperation between land-based, say, anti-ship systems and what's happening at sea, and we can probably imagine circumstances where a long-range fires battery might be allocated in direct support of a commander at sea. And in those circumstances, I think that kind of mechanism's right. But that's not the total. And I worry that when we talk about decision-making, we tend to bias it towards that technical, and the idea of coordinating scarce asset and doing it quickly to be able to strike targets, as if battlefield problems are principally about assigning munitions and weapon systems to targets, which it ain't, particularly on land. We ought to get very good at that part, but that's not the whole picture.
Yeah. And I think leaning on that analogy again, but like talking about fires in terms of allocating a target to a gun line and then affecting that target or whatever. I suppose when a battle group manoeuvres, and I'm just talking to a battle group level, I suppose, but when a battle group manoeuvres, it's sort of very easy for a high headquarters to sort of stick drive, for lack of a better term, that battle group as it manoeuvres and all that sort of stuff. So I think taking that on board. Is there the need for that sort of level of control down all the way down? And will we have the capacity to do that? To be honest,
no, of course. And that's my fear. My fear is that if you think too hard about how to optimise targeting and fires, that potentially you influence your system to think entirely in that way. And of course, the vision is that we'll end up with computing power and a network or a mesh that will allow a advanced computer brain to make decisions about apportioning munitions and the right fire and to the right target better than human beings can. And that may well be true, and it may well be necessary for things like naval battles and for certain aspects maybe of land battle. But if you allow that to filter through your whole system, then, and if you think that computer brains can make all of the decisions better than human beings or inform it, even say for things like battle group or brigade or divisions attack where they should manoeuvre and so on, then there's a real risk, because if that's true, then why would you allow any autonomy to anybody within the system? And it runs entirely counter to the idea of mission command. And I this is something I really take quite seriously, because I do worry that the expectations around technology, and these claims that that they'll support us to make faster and better decisions, is leading us on a path to maybe more centralised systems of C2.
Yeah, and I suppose to link back to Dr. Watling as well, it's like this idea that the C2 element is going to be probably further back than we've seen, and probably have a plethora of information, whether they can use it or not. They talk about the proliferation of sensors and the amount of data that comes through. But I mean, that physical dislocation, and he argues exactly the same as you, that let the reins off a little bit. Do you know what I mean? And let the battle unfold.
Absolutely.
And sort of, it's going to be uncertain, I suppose.
Yeah. And because one of the premises behind the whole network-centric idea and this emphasis on data and decision-making and computing power is the assumption that good decision-making is information intensive, i.e. that the more data you have, the better you'll understand a circumstance, and therefore the better your decision will be. But we know, and for those interested, Grant Chambers, Leanne Rees and I wrote something, I've got probably 10 years ago now, on this, and we found that assumption's false. And in fact, so those who know of Jim Storr, he came to a similar conclusion, that in fact battle is information sensitive, and good commanders can realise what is an important piece of information in the moment, and it normally only require 2 or 3 pieces of sensitive information to make really good battlefield decisions. They don't need lots of it. And it's impossible to know, because of the complexity and dynamism of battle, what that information would be before the battle gets underway. But it's a function of the talent, expertise and experience of the commander that can make the difference, which leads into the next point, is that if we assume that better process, more analysis, more staff work, or even more computing power and data makes for better decisions, then it leads to investing in more staff, more computer systems, bigger headquarters, more analysis. But the evidence is that actually leads to slower decision making and not necessarily good decisions. The other flawed assumption is related to the fact that a near enough decision on the battlefield is good enough. The idea that you get great advantage from better decisions and better knowledge of the circumstances is also flawed. That just acting near enough is sufficient. So the idea that somehow decision making and quality of it and speed gives some great battlefield advantage is actually the main flaw out of all of this.
Yeah, and completely ignores uncertainty, I suppose. It's like,
exactly.
we know all of this stuff. Yeah, that's true, but there's so much that's still uncertain. If we mark and bypass the uncertainty, it's difficult. I mean, we can run off assumptions that we're dwelling on decisions and then making really good, educated decisions based on all the senses that and all the information that we have, when in actual fact we're not acknowledging the uncertainty behind it.
Precisely. And the other, and related to that, is the fact that it's action that wins battles, not knowledge or so on. Now, it's not to dismiss it entirely, but action is what matters. And there's a great book, John Keegan's Intelligence in War, and he provides 4 case studies in it that sort of give this sense that, hey, intelligence in war actually ain't that important, which is interesting, that he writes a whole book on it. But my favourite case study out of it is Crete. And he talks about the fact that we'd broken the German codes by that stage. The Commonwealth forces on Crete knew exactly the timings, the size of the forces that were landing either by parachute or amphibious, where they were landing, everything. And the Commonwealth forces outnumbered the Germans markedly, yet the Germans won the battle, and they won it as a function of pure fighting and intention and action. And that's sort of an exemplar of that sense that, in those circumstances, information doesn't matter. And this is the difference, because I think you could make a case that, well, look, if you want to sink ships, you've got to find them first, and you've got to, having found them, you've got to maintain an understanding of where they are. Then you've got to launch the system. So information and knowledge and transfer of data in that circumstance, absolutely. But we need to be careful we don't bleed over that particular idea into command and control generally.
And I think you talked about commander's experience, or each commander's experience, sort of making better decisions and basing that, I suppose, getting a really good experience as a commander and then backing some. And there's a little bit of intuition, so lean in a little bit, into that intuition stuff. But how do we, noting that sort of the fleeting opportunities to go overseas and do different things and all that sort of stuff, how do we bridge that gap, I suppose, with experience in terms of, I'm talking at the section command level, but also all the way up?
No, that's a great question. So that's key, I think. I mean, the new decision-making doctrine is largely about what we've just been talking about, and puts the commander more central. We had, through our training and so on, put too much reliance on process and analysis and staff work. And when General Krauss wrote this, and we're both of the same mindset, we turned, in some cases, commanders into choosers of options produced by the staff, rather than being central to it. And to some extent, in the way we were practicing it, you were denying the planning process the advantage of the most experienced person available to it, with a sense of what they wanted to do. So that's why we've restored this. But for that to work, you need a competent commander. Putting talent and identifying talent and selection aside, the key part is experience, and like anything, like a good golf swing, that is just exposure over and over and over to as many problems as you can. And because warfare is so dynamic, the greater range of things that you can get exposed to, the better. The obvious thing is that we ought to be in the field and exercising as much as we can. If I understand correctly, this particular idea about exposure into various and dynamic circumstances is a feature now of our training system, either through shoots, through COAC, or even the way we're training cadets at RMC, which is part of it. But the more exercises we can expose commanders to and so on, the better. But that's only so much. Of course, I think Clausewitz, if not others, have told us, well, if you can't get that experience directly in that form, the next best thing is to read about what others have done. And I imagine some people listening will be dismissive of this, but some very great commanders who grew up in times where they had very limited opportunity to get into the field developed their minds as a function of reading. Patton is a classic case. So I would encourage everybody listening to read from as many different wars, from as many different perspectives, but find ones that are talking about command decisions, preferably in the first person, to understand what the decisions were, why they were made, under what context. That things like things like Slim, even something at much lower level like In Good Company. There's 1,000 books out there. Read as widely as you can. Draw the lessons vicariously. That's another one. And look, I also think that we draw a lot from each other simply by the conversations we have in the mess on a Friday or whatever other forum is when we're testing these ideas and so on is another opportunity.
And I think that was a common sort of going through the COVID times. I don't want to drag that back up because I think we've left it in the past sort of thing. But the whole doing courses in person all together and stuff and that ability to sort of network is just like, you can't, that's the lessons from different joint warfighters and different warfighters in different brigades. Like that's where you can sort of pass on that knowledge. I suppose.
Agree.
Yeah.
Agree. And where those listening might be looking at some of the courses in the Army where we have taken away the opportunity to come together in the same location, and we've put some courses and portions of it remotely done. Can I just reassure everybody that the Chief and I and the Forces Commander are having a very close look at that on the basis of it made sense around a certain number of circumstances and conditions at the time those decisions were made, but the circumstances and the situation's changing. And so making sure we get face-to-face back and everybody in a place where those debates and discussions are happening, what was a real valuable element of our courses, to the extent where we might have lost that in a couple of places, we're having a strong and hard look at maybe restoring that.
Yeah, no. And to go back to your, I suppose, reading point, for those that are not like reading often and a lot, go back and listen to some of the podcasts we've gone through. Went through Larkin, Sparrow and Gulf Force, maintaining a forward observation line in the past during 1942. And then subsequently Jack went through Ukraine and Israel and some really contemporary case studies that all you have to do is listen to it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Very good.
So I suppose coming back to the commander, the centric approach, different to centralised command, it's a commander-centric planning process, I suppose. Yep. Can you just define the two just to make it clear, I suppose?
So centralised command is putting all of the authorities and the decisions into a single sort of higher headquarters on the assumption that that headquarters will know best and then just directs what everybody ought to do. I don't like the term command-centric. I don't like any word that has centric in it. But a planning process that brings the commander and asks them to play a more active role in the planning process, that's probably a better way to describe this, I think is really what we're talking about here. And look, some people might argue that, well, how is that different to the planning process we had? And that's a fair point. The previous planning process, I think, had that idea in mind, but I think we'd grown over the years, and even, it doesn't seem like long ago for me, but it might to even when I was doing my majors courses and so on, the way we were instructing at the time, which is where the instructor, I don't know if this still happens, so forgive me, I am a little out of touch and I acknowledge it, but where the instructor was acting as both commander and instructor, and then we used to act as the staff. So the instructor, in an attempt not to influence the planning process so much, would then let the staff just come up with options, and then we had these points of briefing to the commander, and in between the commander effectively stayed out of touch with what was going on. And I think as a consequence of it, we grew generations of officers that thought, well, that's the right way to do it. And both staff and commanders expected for this to happen this way. And I even had this experience when I was the CO of 2RER in 2013, and we were just at the very beginning of the process to formulate what the future amphibious capability would be. We just invented the C series of exercises, and it was on one particular one. We had to do it was a company raid, but it's a company raid. And my sense was, look, I'm not going to plan the raid as the commanding officer. I'll apportion the relevant staff. It was John Eccleston was the company commander at the time, and I'll portion the stuff to him, but let him own. He owns all the risk. He owns the consequence. He'll be the guy on the ground. I'm just the CO back on a ship and, can provide a certain amount of support. And there was a couple of initial decisions for me to make with the broader amphibious task force staff, but quite quickly I made those and just pushed it down. And there was another thing too where made before we'd even gone down the road of providing options. I said, look, before you go along, time is important here. Here's the rough solution, with the exception of telling me where it's wildly dangerous. That's it. But after we did both, I sort of got this feedback, and the chief of staff said, so you're the way you're doing this, you're depriving the staff of the opportunity to explore its full creativity and come back to you with the. And so because it caught me by surprise. I thought I was actually doing a good thing by saying, hey, look, let's not mess around. This is a NEO. We largely know the construct that's pretty simple. Or in the case of, hey, this is a company commander's business, let him, give him the stuff and then let him go away with it with some pretty limited direction. But the staff itself was angry at me for the, and because I think we'd developed an orthodoxy around this, no, the commander plays this quite rigid role, and we as the staff do this, and how dare you mess with it? What's this weirdness you're up to? But look, I suspect in certain places, I think in Armoured Corps, for example, I think throughout those years they maintained a sense of the commander being at the centre, but I don't think that was across
widely.
The board.
Yeah, and I think from a captain's course perspective, much the same. The commander waltzes in playing the instructor playing the commander waltzes in and gets some back briefs that are not really guided, and then goes through. Elwick for the Mod 3 of COAC was the opposite. And General Krause, obviously. I did one that he ran as well, and he was very much more centred. And the Chief of Staff had Colonel Deuce had a far more input into the, and it was awesome to see. I think to completely counter and break that up. From the approach that has been.
So I think that's it. But of course, it's neither. The whole point of this, while it's trying to reorient us back from maybe an imbalance. It's not. It's neither one or the other. I mean, he makes the point in drafting this that in certain circumstances, when you have the luxury of time and you have a great deal of complexity, a proper consideration of the context and so on, where you can afford it, becomes really, really important. Not as a way of coming up then with a very detailed and prescriptive solution necessarily. The other thing where you also got to be clear about is what it is you're particularly doing. You can't. Whereas, say, for an advance, in essence, you can give almost entire license and freedom and autonomy to your subordinate commanders with some very loose control measures to make sure you don't end up running into each other. But for a withdrawal or an amphibious landing, you can't exercise that freedom. You can't have it. Your subordinate commanders deciding at their own times of which they come off the ship, and because you've got to coordinate the timings, the helicopters and so on in a sequence way. So it's not one or the other. The great art is knowing as a commander the relative degree of control and how you exercise it in a particular circumstance. And it sort of goes back to where I began. If you start to think of warfare as a technical enterprise, then it leads you on a path that doesn't treat it as an art, and judgment sort of goes away, and you'll tend to want to draw everything up. I think the other concern is also around risk. I think if somebody thinks that there's a computer system with some algorithms that might help you with courses of action for a particular tactical problem, I worry that human nature will become dependent on it. And whereas risk around making decisions, not in a workplace health and safety risk, but a real risk to say, I'm going to risk the destruction of this brigade in order to take advantage of this opportunity and progress the mission, in a bold, audacious action. I'm not sure that you're ever going to get an algorithm that does that, and the algorithm can't give you the nerve that Clausewitz talks about, the thing that sort of Napoleon or a Patton or somebody has, that the nerve to sort of accept the risk and then stand up and continue in the face of it. An algorithm might do that. So in that, for many people, particularly the more cautious, the algorithm will become sort of a crutch that you rely on and say, well, after the battle, if I have this audacious plan and it fails, in the court of public opinion or the court of law, at least I can say, oh, well, that's what the algorithm told me to do, so I was relying on it. You can say, well, why didn't you do what the algorithm said? And I worry that if we start relying too much on computer systems, that you can see we might lose that audaciousness and risk and nerve that commanders ought to have.
Yeah, so I think there are two schools of thought, I suppose. One is that the plethora of information and the technology is completely changing the way we do warfare, right? You're obviously not in that camp somewhat. It's a balancing scale, but like there's still intuition and sort of, I suppose, courage to take like strong, decisive action. And Jack centres a lot of his writing on that decisive action still being key to any,
absolutely.
and probably more important than ever.
Yeah,
I suppose,
because context matters. And context happens at a particular place, and it's immediate, and it's normally only felt by those who are present in the moment. So by removing decisions out of the context, can almost self-evidently be a dangerous thing. The other point too around those who buy into the sort of decision advantage, and that there's advantage to making speedier and faster and more decisions. I think that that's based on a false premise too, that depending on the circumstance of the two sides, it's not true that both sides have to make an equal number of decisions. And the obvious example of this is in an ambush. So the ambusher, who's laying in wait, has an entire design for battle and has anticipated largely everything, might in the battle have to make 1 or 0 decisions. The poor bastard caught in the ambush might have to make 100, depending on what the circumstance is. So the idea is that, so even by design of the battle and how you go about it, so you don't even need technology to do that. It can be a function of, and of course, if you centralise all your decision making, you might need to make 1,000 decisions. But of course, naturally, if you divest all those decisions down, your organisation is effectively making 1 million decisions, but you've just spread all those decisions out while you and your headquarters might only have to make 2 or 3 crucial decisions. I mean, that's the great merit in it. How that applies to a future system for fires and long range and precision, I'm not sure. And I sort of said maybe we need to treat two differently, but I still think that the expectation that we will end up with a meshed network that can promise everything that's been promised, I doubt it. And all the evidence of the technology now suggests it's a long way away anyway. That we run the risk even under that system of centralising it too much and it becoming actually quite slow and so on. So where, and part of our experimentation and conceptual work ought to be, where is the right balance? How do you make sure a battery of firing anti-ship missiles can still support a task force at sea, even if it is disconnected from the broader system? How do you enable that? That I think is an area of really important, serious work.
I think, a common theme is it's going to be harder. You're going to have to rely on more experience, so build up as much as you can.
Yeah,
I suppose.
exactly.
And then definitely harder on the commander themselves. I suppose that interesting segue to talk about the tools that we've changed, I suppose, or the approach that we've changed to decision making. I suppose. What is the new system? Everyone goes through Wonko and RMC, and they there's a map in the left hand and a C map card in the right hand side, and they go through the bouncing ball. I suppose at a tactical level, it probably doesn't change that much. But when we get to staff maps and through the IMAP to the staff map, what are the changes?
I think the simplest answer to that is if you haven't read the doctrine yet, it's the same. It's the same. It's just written in a way that returns a bit of art and judgment back to it and describes potentially better than what we did in previous versions where the role of the commander is. It's some of these vagaries, a greater sense of uncertainty and gives people perhaps a broader sense of when it's more appropriate to fall back on procedure and to rely more heavily on staff analysis and the circumstances where it's probably quite right to value more and to use more the intuitive experience of the commander. So look, so I think in some senses people might go, yeah, but look, what's the difference? I think the difference is in the expression of the role of commander, the relationship to the staff, and the nature of war and battlefields is better captured in this newer doctrine than perhaps in our past.
And further sort of emphasises not to take that step back and just come in and inject
exactly.
at certain points.
Exactly.
Commander's guidance hit right at the start, and then all the planning assumptions change, and then we're still going off on all the staff, having been a staff in a regiment headquarters and brigade headquarters, like we're going off on a tangent here, and it's like we need sort of somewhat to come back in. So I suppose given a clear left and right from back and cliche, but for lack of a better term, as to what the commander's role along the way is and how involved they should be. So
that's right. Yep.
I suppose is that the hope that all the commanders read the decision making and planning process and they lean in far more than they have been.
It's suggesting that they should. Yep. But it's suggesting they should in the hope that we've prepared them properly, and because there is a risk, and it even talks in here about bias. There is a risk that if you with overemphasis on a commander, if the commander is incompetent or lacks the appropriate experience and is more heavily invested, that let's be clear-eyed about this. There's no easy solution. But the other thing too, though, is we've got to remember that, I think it is discussed in here, is that there are circumstances where the commander makes a choice to go forward and to actually exercise influence over a particular portion of the battle, and in their absence, the staff might have to do work around to plan things in the absence of the direction of the commander and use its judgment and so on. It allows entirely for that circumstance too. I mean, and those familiar will know that's precisely largely what Rommel did. I mean, his chief of staff was doing a lot of the real hard work back in the headquarters while he himself positioned himself forward on the idea that if battlefield decisions are really a function of 2 or 3 pieces of really important information you won't know, that being where the decision, where the thing will be decided, is more likely to reveal that to you than necessarily being remote behind a screen. And if I can just give another example here, actually, of where technology sort of works against it. I can't remember who was. I think it was General Blaine, when he was commander of 7th Brigade, was giving an example where, and it was on an exercise, but a particular battle group attack had sort of stopped, and he understood. He went forward himself, and this particular combat team was sort of was stuck. Nobody was taking any action to lead and to restore movement through the attack. And he asked, "Look, where's the company commander?" And they said, "Oh, he's back in the carrier." And so he went back and said, "What are you doing?" And the company commander was there. So, "Oh, look, I'm leading from here. I've got all. I can see everything here. I've got the battle management system. I can see more. I know the enemies. I know what's happening around me." And he said, "Yeah, but that's not what's important right now. Yeah. What's important is to get your troops moving and to attack. Leadership isn't a fact of sitting back and knowing and sort of the in the castle 9 miles back from the front in World War I. Your leadership is necessary to get forward and to actively get your soldiers moving and attacking through." So that forgive me, it's slightly off where we were, but it just gives you a sense of the dangers of some of the tech in our.
And I think that's exactly what we've been talking to. So, but I suppose I'd like to make the argument that if the commander is more involved throughout the planning process when he or she is there, then his staff are better informed when he or she is not there to make better decisions in the absence, rather than
and they get to understand each other better, and then the staff can more intuitively respond in a way that they know that their commander might think, you're spot on, mate.
And make, I suppose, better intuitive decisions and take decisive action in the absence. Are there any other, you talked about no broad sweeping changes really. Are there any other sort of changes inside the plan series that in the decision-making process that are wildly different to it? Should anyone be scared about?
No, not at all. Not at all. They'll be very familiar with it. This is more of a subtle. The change is subtle, but the implications are profound, I think. And look, I strongly recommend it. And you get the sense from what I've been talking about that I believe in it strongly. This doctrine takes into account the nature of the battlefield more fully than what we'd expressed in the past, which was really sort of leaning heavily on the American process developed in the 80s and 90s, which was in that fashion was far more procedural, and this sense that process solves problems. This sort of restores things, I think, back to the right balance. So I support it thoroughly. And as it starts to emerge, and I know it's being looked at emerging into training in some of our training centres, look, I encourage you to go into it in good faith and to expect this to be a positive change.
Yeah. And I suppose talking about training commander and also commanders as well, how do you hope that RMC, Wonko, and sort of the different Land Warfare Centre, how do you sort of expect them to use this new process?
Look, to be honest, Todd, I'm not sure how to answer that question, and maybe I ought not answer the question, because to some extent they'll work out how best to do it. Because I think it's a challenge. You can understand it when I was explaining before how that tendency to dual hat the instructor as the commander, and to, that's easy to do. And it has a bunch of good but how each school takes it on, manifests it, works out how to make sure the right parts are taken on, puts the command at the centre, I'm not in, and forgive me, it might be a cop-out, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure that those schools will work it out better than I can describe right now.
Test and adjust. I mean, COAC moving up to Canungra, and then so shifting all the maps change now, and all the AO changes, I suppose. But having, from an outsider looking in and going through the course, to have commanders of actual battalions come back and act as the CO inside a planning team, and then have us on courses, OPSOs and log planners and all that sort of stuff that was the first time I've ever done that like that. And to have experience with COs that I'm not familiar with, and see how they think and see how they use the intuition. And I think that in that process puts more emphasis on that CO to actually really teach people things, and it stops the instructors from having to do it all themselves.
Look, I agree. I think that's good. But let's be candid. As long as you select the right CO, not everybody's the same. And potentially some, like in any organisation, some won't be. You want to make sure that in doing so, you're passing on the best of what this is, because no matter how good this doctrine is, we will still produce, quite naturally, more cautious, more controlling as a function of personality people, and that's merely a fact of life.
So for commanders, I suppose, pass on the experience, be incredibly involved in the decision making and planning process, keep volunteering to come to different courses to act as commanders. Absolutely.
Agree entirely.
So thank you, sir, for talking us through both, I suppose, future land warfare and how it shapes the planning process, the new decision making and planning process as well, and how commander centric. Again, critique don't like the idea of centric, but commander centric process. And I suppose the main message that I got out of is to lean in and really take that. I suppose everyone talks about the privileges of command. It's even more so. It's even more privileged now in that you get to impart all the experience on and really lean into the planning process.
Absolutely.
Thanks, sir. Can't wait for. No doubt we'll put another calendar invite, and we'll come back and speak about something else.
Absolutely. We will.
Thanks, sir. Cheers.
Right. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.